All right, and welcome back to Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I am joined by Professor Kloppenborg, who has written Christ Associations. And this is a book that I'm still reading this through a second time. It is so packed with information, and it is so dense with it goes so deep into early Christian origins. It's called Christ Associations, Connecting and Belonging in the Ancient City. And I'm really happy to have you on today, Professor Kloppenborg. Welcome to Gnostic Informant. And before we get into the questions, why don't you tell
Thanks.
people who have no idea about this book a little rundown about the book?
Okay, thanks very much for having me, Derek. Um, I began to write the book after I noticed that about all the things that we don't know about early Christian groups. And I mean, sometimes people make assumptions about them, but we don't actually know very much. For example, how big were they? Were they 10 people? Were they 20 people? Were there 100, 200 people? How did they finance themselves? How did they fund their meals? They had meals. How did they actually pay for that? Um, uh, so there's a whole lot of kind of basic questions about how we imagine these groups to have been, where we just don't have very much data. But what we do have is a great deal of data from other clubs and associations in the ancient world, clubs that were, or associations that were organized around the cult of a deity, Isis or Serapis or Mithras or Atargatis, and clubs or groups that were organized around a common profession like tent making or weaving and so forth. So, and we have answers to all of those questions about group size, about funding, about the relationship to elites and so forth. We've got lots of data on that. So the point of the book is to mobilize that rich data that we have from other groups to help us think about what was at least possible, or what was at least likely for Christ groups. So I argue from the known, where we've got rich data, to the unknown, and use the known data at least to set some kind of limits or brackets around our imagination about a whole lot of questions like this.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so I'm just wondering, in the beginning, you mentioned right off the bat, and you remind us about this. It's about your approach is not genealogical. You're not looking for influences like, say, oh, they borrowed from the Dionysus tradition. You mentioned that it's heuristic.
Yes.
What exactly you mean by that? Is it more data driven?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly data driven. Heuristic comes from the Greek root heurisko, to find or to discover,
Oh, nice.
and so a heuristic inquiry is taking one set of data, say the data that we have from ancient weaving guilds, and putting it beside what we know or what we don't know about Christ groups, and letting those two data sets ask each other questions. So what it does is it generates questions that we should ask of the Christ groups. So, for example, if we know a lot about how a cultic group funded itself, that is, how they paid for meals and so forth, then we put that beside Christ groups, and we say, well, what are the possibilities for a Christ group funding itself? And we've got 2 or 3 different models from associative data. So as you said, this is not a genealogical argument. That is, I don't have to argue that Christ groups were influenced or derived from synagogues or from Greek cultic groups. That's not what it's about. And to illustrate a heuristic inquiry, I use in the introduction an analogy from paleontology. This is the section in the book called "The Tale of T-Rex," where the T-Rex Sue at the Chicago Museum of Natural History. All we've got left of Sue is bones. We don't have any muscles. We don't have any nerve tissue, and we have a lot of questions about how Sue actually moved. and what the heck that big tail was about. A heuristic approach, and this has actually been done by paleontologists, is to compare Sioux to an American crocodile. And these are not genealogically related to one another. That is, crocodiles did not descend from T-Rexes. They have as close relationship to birds as they do to reptiles. But in any case, turns out that both T-Rex and an American crocodile have what's called an insertion scar on their femur. And an insertion scar is where a muscle connects to a ligament, connects to a bone. So when you see an insertion scar on the top part of Sioux's femur, you realize it's there because there's a muscle that's attached, and that muscle is the muscle in the tail. So then it was possible to observe the movement of an American crocodile and how the tail moves back and forth. And the tail, the two big muscles in the tail are actually the muscles that give its legs explosive forward movement. So you see that in the crocodile, you see it in T-Rex, and then you make the inference they probably functioned in the same way. There's no genealogical argument there.
Good point.
That's a heuristic argument where you're saying there are two things that look alike, and these two phenomena help me. The phenomenon of the American crocodile helps me think and discover things about T-Rexes. So I'm doing the same thing, taking association data and laying it beside what we know about early Christ groups and saying, what does one set of data help? How does it help me think about the other set of data?
Wow, that's a really well explained way to put that. Now it makes a lot more sense. I'm gonna go. I have a Patreon member who has a question from the book too, and his name is Jason, and he says, in your book, you repeatedly stress the importance of performative aspect of associations. Just wondering what possibilities this can raise to understanding of, say, Christianity in Edessa pre-Nicaea. Bauer famously pointed out that Christianity of Marcion and Bardician was the order of the day. Would the communal meals of these groups look indistinguishable from the Orthodox to the outsiders? It's a very deep question.
Okay, the communal meals. First off, the issue of a meal being performative. What I mean by that is Christ groups and other kinds of groups. They engaged in communal meals as a way to signal a kind of equality. It might be fictive equality, but it's at least a kind of equality among members. That is, when you eat with someone at dinner, when you recline with someone at dinner, that's a kind of physical and ritual expression that we all have common values and common interests and so forth. So the meal is performative in the sense that it performs a kind of value that the group has. So in that sense, Christ groups and Manichaean groups and other kinds of groups, all of those that engaged in communal dining, were engaged in a kind of communal performance, a way of saying equality in some sense is a value of our group, and here's how we show it off. Here's how we demonstrate that equality by eating together.
Interesting. And do you think that when he said about Marcion's theology being the sort of order of the day, would you agree with that, or do you think it's a little? What do you think about that part? The second part.
Well, Marcion had a kind of rough reception in Rome with his theology. I say almost nothing about Marcion because the book really doesn't deal with doctrine and belief at all.
Sure.
It deals with actions, with ritual actions, social organization, and so forth. But at least from one point of view, a Marcionite group would not look very different to an outsider than a so-called Orthodox or proto-Orthodox groups. That is, to the extent that they engaged in baptism, that they engaged in communal meals, that meals were focused around the reverencing of Christ, Christos. They probably would have looked to an external observer pretty much the same. And external observers pagans looking at Christ groups didn't sort of micro classify them into this group or that group, because they really did pretty much the same thing. Christians themselves, of course, partition all the groups into Orthodox and various kinds of heresies, because they're focused not so much on rituals, but they're focused on belief sets.
Yeah. You have a really an interesting passage about just to stay on the communal meals for 1 second. You talked about how it can show equality, as these early groups do show, but there's also an intense competition happening. Can you expand on that a little bit? Can you expand on that just real quick?
Well, ancient dining practices occurred typically in a room called a triclinium, where there was a kind of U-shaped couch, and the various seats at this U-shaped couch had different kind of social valences. So in the middle couch, on one edge of the middle couch was always the best seat. And the worst seat would be one close to the door. And everybody knew that. So in meals, there was automatically a tension between, on one hand, as I say, they're performing a kind of equality because you're eating together. But on the other hand, there are better and worse seats. And Luke's gospel knows all about that. He says, when you go to a banquet, don't take the best seat, lest somebody more important than you come along and you get demoted and laughed at. Wow, yeah. So you take the worst seat, and so then someone will say, come up, that is, move up in rank. So this is a world that Luke certainly knows about, and other gospel writers, they know about it. So there's a kind of built-in tension in dining between the kind of value of equality that comes from eating together and the fact that there are worse and better seats. And that certainly did produce competition. And Luke actually suggests that there is competition. So he says, you actually shouldn't, go and sit in the best seat. That's a competitive action because you're displacing somebody else. So he knows very well that competition is possible, and we've got all sorts of other examples from antiquity of exactly this kind of seat competition. Sometimes seat stealing, that is, someone gets up from their seat and somebody else jumps into it because it's a better seat. So it's these groups. On one hand, they're kind of performing equality, and on the other hand, they're intensely competitive because it's important. It's important to have your status recognized, and each of these groups found ways to kind of manage competition so that it didn't get out of hand, but at the same time wanting to instantiate the particular values of communing together or eating together or Christ being present with them and things like that. So meals were always really interesting places to look to see this kind of tension. And of course, when somebody important comes to a group, they're going to get the best seat. And that might involve displacing somebody who hitherto had the best seat. So when you think concretely about the meals of Christ groups and the meals of other groups, it doesn't take too much imagination to realize that these were not sort of kumbaya events where everybody held hands and smiled at each other. There was certainly the possibility of competitive behavior.
Wow, that's interesting. So I'm just to sort of bounce around a little bit. You're kind of critical of Acts when it talks about Paul saying he only baptized 2 people, but then he actually has a passage about this character named Dionysus, and I think you mentioned that there's sort of something happening where there's a conflicting data there. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
That's actually that's the difference between Paul's own letters and what he reports. You're referring to 1 Corinthians, where he reports that he says he hasn't baptized many people in Corinth. And when you read Acts, it gives us a rather different picture. So Acts talks about both Paul's encounter with a Roman procurator named Sergius Paulus on Cyprus, and Acts says he believed. Acts doesn't say he was baptized and his whole family. And then when he gets to Athens, he has a kind of debate with philosophers, and it said that Dionysius of the Areopagus, this was a legislative assembly, believed too. So twice Acts makes a suggestion that somebody of very, very high social and political status became a Christ follower. I'm critical of that because it just frankly seems to me unbelievable. A procreator like Sergius Paulus was only on Cyprus for 9 months. There's no reason on earth why he would have become a Christ follower. As a Roman senator, he was devoted to the Roman gods, and he's only there briefly. And similarly with Dionysius in Athens, in both cases, curiously, Acts does not say they got baptized. I think Acts realizes maybe I can say they believed, which really means they took us seriously. But Acts is not going to be able to get away with saying, and they got baptized, because he knows that's just not very likely. So there certainly is a difference between the social level of people that Paul talks about as becoming Christ believers and the social level that the author of Acts says became believers through Paul's preaching and so forth. Now, Acts is written at least 50, maybe 60, 70 years after Paul, when it might have been possible for persons of very high status to become Christ believers. But in Paul's day,
Sure, that makes sense. Now, with these funeral burials, I noticed that you mentioned how if they don't have a Chi Rho or some sort of symbol, it's almost impossible to tell if it's a Christian burial.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, you can explain on that real quick, and then we can go with the next one.
Yeah. So presumably Christians buried Christians in the 1st century and up to the end of the 2nd century buried their dead, as everybody else did. It would have been impious not to do so, and they probably affixed a funerary inscription. Here lies whoever it is, Serapion, who died at the age of 46 years or something like that, a kind of standard funerary formula. So presumably many of the funerary inscriptions, or at least some of the funerary inscriptions that we've got from the 1st and 2nd century, are Christian burials. The problem is we can't tell, because it's not until Christ believers start adding paralinguistic marks like this Chi Rho, a monogram of Chi and Rho together, standing for Christos or Christianos, or even later than that, putting a cross, or sometimes a picture of an anchor or a fish, or various other kinds of paralinguistic marks. Those are the things that tell us, that's a Christian burial, because they're including all of these signs. And eventually, Christian names start getting used. So in the 1st and 2nd century, Christians used names that were just the ordinary names that people in the 1st and 2nd century used. Later on, they start to use some biblical names. You start to get Isaac and Jacob and things like this. That starts to make you think, this is actually a Christian we're dealing with, and they're naming themselves with a distinctive name. Or Christophorus, Christopher, is a kind of dead giveaway, right?
Yeah.
So it's not until you get either recognizable Christian names or recognizable paralinguistic marks that you can actually say, I got a Christian burial here. Yeah. But presumably we're looking at earlier burials that are, some of which are Christian. It's just that there's no way to tell that they are.
Yeah. What's the earliest? When did we start seeing frequent amounts of symbols like this? Is it before?
It starts in the third century. That's when you start to get a good number of Chi Rho monograms, and you start to get sometimes the term a believer starts to show up. To call someone a believer in the Greco-Roman world, you just wouldn't do that. That's not what you say about them. But Christians call each other believers, at least in the 3rd century. So when you get that word, this person is a believer, or if you get the phrase, the brothers buried him, the Adelphoi buried him, it could be a Jewish burial because Jews also called themselves brothers, but it is a term that Christians used as well. So 3rd century, you start to see that vocabulary appearing, and Cairo marks, and later on actual crosses and so forth. And then you know you've got Christian burials on your hand.
And before that, where people just was it because it wasn't a legal religion yet, and they just didn't want to, they weren't allowed to? Was there any social reasons?
No, it probably was just because. Well, think of a modern analogy. Go to a graveyard right now and ask yourself, how many Catholics can I identify? How many Presbyterians can I identify? In most cases, you're not going to be able to, because they're just using, here lies X, survived by his wife and his 3 children. Well, right. That doesn't tell you anything. And so it's not different in antiquity. Christians buried each other using just the standard ways of burying people.
Wow. Do you think it's possible that, like for today, using today's as an example, you might have a Catholic family and they're burying somebody who's part of a Catholic family, but they're really not Catholic. They might even have some, they might even believe in Islam or something, but like the family has like a Catholic, like a funeral for them. Is that possible happening in the ancient world with these Christians, maybe?
Well, you do have family tombs and collective tombs where all members of one family, which would include not only birth families but slaves and freed slaves, would show up in that tomb. And you have also tombs that are managed by say groups of weavers or groups of stonemasons, and so you could get persons with somewhat different religious beliefs being buried in that collective tomb simply because they were a weaver and they belonged to the Weavers Club. And likewise, in a family tomb, you can get some heterogeneous burials, people who are associated with the family and therefore are entitled to be buried there, but are not blood members, at least. I mean, it's pretty common to see a burial tomb where it's the nuclear family plus the slaves that belong to the family, and enslaved persons, and also the freed slaves that belong to the family, and their wives and children. So, these burials can be quite big and quite diverse, and all organized around, say, a single family.
Interesting. That makes sense. Now, I want to ask you about how different were these different assemblies? For example, like how different was Ephesians compared to the Corinthians? Like, was there a wide range of how these assemblies took part, or size maybe, or are they pretty similar?
Well, I think it's the 2nd chapter of the book looks at a variety of association types and also a variety of types of Christ groups. And what I argued there, I'm not original with this argument, but if you look at Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, which is probably the first of the letters we have, he's addressing people who are pagans. That is, there's apparently not a Jewish component to that group, because he says, "Don't you remember how you turned from serving idols to serve the true and living God?" Well, you wouldn't say that to a Jewish group or to Jews. He also doesn't ever quote the Hebrew Bible in 1 Thessalonians. So all of that suggests that we're dealing with probably an exclusively pagan group, and it's the only one of the letters where he cites the fact that he was a hand worker, that he worked with his hands day and night as a way to connect with the group. And that suggests to me that he's addressing probably a trade group. Paul in Acts is said to have been a skenopoios, which probably means, sometimes it gets translated as tent maker. Skene is also an awning, the kind of awning you would put in front of your house or over a stadium to keep the sun off. So he could have been an awning maker, and there are groups of awning makers. So I think it's plausible to imagine that he connected originally with the Thessalonians on the basis of his own trade. And you could do that easily in an ancient city because trades tended to organize themselves by neighborhood. What I say to my students is, if you drive into an American city that you have not visited before and you cannot find a Starbucks or a Home Hardware, you're not an American, right? Because you have inbuilt cultural knowledge about where you're going to find a Starbucks.
Yeah.
And similarly, an ancient person, they enter a city that they have never visited before, and within a few minutes, they can find where the weavers are, or where the tent makers are, or where they know where the central part of the city is going to be. There's going to be a main temple, probably to Jupiter, the best and the greatest, and then you're going to be able to find where other groups are simply probably by simple questions. Where are the silversmiths located? And they say, well, just down this street and to your right. The suggestion here is that Paul's Thessalonian group was an all-male group, as occupational guilds tended to be. They tended to be organized around gender. And it was an occupational guild, probably his own occupation of a skenopoios, awning maker or something like that. And when he writes later to the Thessalonians after he's gone to Athens, he cites the fact that he is a hand worker as a way to connect with them. Interestingly, when he writes to the Corinthians later, he also says that he's a hand worker, but he uses that as a way to distance himself from them. He says, you claim wisdom and you claim to speak well. I'm just a hand worker. So that tells us, I think, immediately that the group in Thessaloniki and the group in Corinth are probably differently constituted.
Wow.
In Corinth, there are clearly women. There's no indication of women present in the Thessalonian group. Now, surely there are. If it's an occupational guild, the men probably have partners, have wives.
Yeah.
But when he writes to them, he uses gender exclusive language and male oriented language. So
Sure.
Already there's probably a difference between Corinth and Thessaloniki. And in Philippi, Philippi is clearly also a group where there are women. He mentions them by name. So I think we have to be prepared to imagine that Paul's group didn't always look the same. They look different depending on which particular city they were in.
This is so fascinating to think about it this way, because you're really getting a picture of what was happening and how the politics was. And speaking of the Thessalonian church, you have a really funny, interesting paragraph in there where you talk about how you mentioned how there's no women in the Thessalonica church, but in the letter to the Thessalonians in chapter 4, he says each of you must know to control your skios. And now that word skios is, what does that mean? Male member? Is that what that means?
Yeah, it means penis.
Yeah. So who is he talking to? What does that mean then?
Well, then he explains. So that is, he still has this very strong view of sexual propriety. That is, a male who's a Christ believer needs to show restraint, and the skios can only be used in one context, and that is in marriage and procreation of kids and so forth. In Roman culture, if you were a person who owned a slave, a slave was deemed to be universally accessible to you, whether it was male or female, whether the owner was male or female, and whether the slave was male or female. They were accessible to their owner in all ways, including sexual ways. Now, it's not clear whether Paul is addressing people who were slave owners, but many artisans' guilds had slaves. So this would also be a way to say to them, there is a rule, or there is a certain practice among Christ groups that sexual relationships are to be kept in a narrow band of husband-wife relationships, not owner-slave relationships, or other kinds of adulterous relationships. So in that sense, he's espousing a pretty conservative or pretty standard kind of Jewish ethic, and wanting this to be promulgated in the Thessalonian group.
That's very fascinating. Now, I had another question on that I wanted to get to. Oh yeah, so these guilds, I mean, how is this sort of likened to today's like union groups, where you have different groups that they work on the same projects? And another side question, I guess, would be, is every region have their own major distribution product? Maybe is it like certain cities have certain guilds that sell certain things? Or is that what it is?
Yeah, so the ancient economy was diversified in the sense that you would have some professions like weaving, which you probably found everywhere, but silver was produced in certain areas, and therefore you would have silver smiths and goldsmiths, excuse me, located in those areas, and linen, which needs linen comes from flax. So where there's flax growing areas, then there's going to be linen producers and linen weavers. So there's a certain amount of regional diversification depending on what kind of agricultural and other kinds of products are available there. But the guilds are something like unions in the sense that they're organized around a particular activity. They're unlike unions in the sense that guilds really weren't in much of a position to control markets, either labor markets or other markets, and their main function was really social. You get together, you organize a club, as it were, because you're all weavers, and then you can have weekly meals or monthly meals, and you can have parades and things like that. The guilds they simply weren't in a legal position to control the economy in the way that trade unions now, while they don't, some states, of course, they don't control the economy at all. But they didn't have the kind of economic muscle that trade unions today have.
Wow, that's very fast, but that makes a lot of sense. And I noticed that you have like some diagrams and some images of, I think it's like the like list, looks like what a plaque would look like, but there's like list of names on there from some of these areas. One of them has on top of it, Imperator Caesar Augustus, and I might have missed it. There might have been an explanation what that meant. Do you know what that meant? What was that for?
Well, when you make a membership list, it usually begins with an indication of the date, and instead of having 2022 as a date, one of the ways that you dated is by the regnal year of the emperor.
Oh, I see.
So in the 12th year of Augustus, or in the so forth. And also, sometimes there's a dedication to the emperor. That didn't mean that the emperor was a member of your Weavers Club. It's just this was a way of signaling loyalty.
Sure.
So you begin with this header, usually in large letters, indicating the regnal year or the dedication to the emperor, and then you get a list of members underneath that. In fact, I've done a lot in that book by looking at membership lists, because what they tell us is they tell us all sorts of interesting things. In the ancient world, you can tell a person's legal status by their name.
Right.
So a slave does not have a family name, and a slave does not have a father's name. So slaves didn't have fathers. Of course, biologically they did, but legally, a slave doesn't have a father. A slave has an owner. But if someone has a three-part name, Gaius Julius Caesar or Marcus Tullius Cicero, you know that this person is a Roman citizen, because that's the mark of a Roman citizen, to have this tria nomina, the three-part name. And you can, if you look at one of these lists, you can see that there are some names that are typically slave names. So if someone is called Elpis, Hope, it's a feminine name. They're probably a slave. If they're named Lydia, that refers to the area in Asia Minor called Lydia, but that would be a slave who comes from Lydia, and so you call her Lydia. Or Achaicus, the Greek. So you get a feel for what names are likely to be slave names, what names are freeborn names, which names signal that a person is a Roman citizen. And so when you look at one of these lists, you immediately get a kind of picture. It's almost like a group portrait, where you can see, this group has elite persons, it has non-elite persons, it's got people from the East because they've got Syrian names or Anatolian names. So you get a picture. Is this a mixed ethnic group? Is it a group that's uniform Greek or uniform Roman? And so forth. So as I say, we would now look at a group photo with all people lined up, and you'd get a sense of who the people are by looking at the picture. Well, these albla that we have do exactly the same thing. You look at the names and you can get a kind of picture of what the group actually looked like.
Wow, I got a super chat from Mary Smith, and she asked, most common guild among early Christians? What's the most common guild among early Christians?
That's a hard question to answer. Let me see. In Egypt, we've got some weavers where actually the one that I think of right now, I wouldn't say this is the most common, but we've got at least one guild from Egypt in the late fourth century, or early fourth century, they're called tow merchants. Tow is what happens to flax after you have removed the inside of it to make linen, and you're left with a kind of straw. And the tow then is turned into rope. So that we have from the village of Oxyrhynchus in Upper Egypt, a guild of tow workers, and we happen to know that at least some of them are Christians, because one of them has a copy of the first page of Paul's letter to the Romans in his possession, which he might have copied out himself. And another one was a lector in a church near Oxyrhynchus. But I wouldn't say, to your questioner, that there was one particular guild that Christians tended to gravitate to. I presume that Christians, if you lived in a town where there were weavers, then there's probably Christians in the Weavers Guild. If they're silversmiths or they're purple dryers or whatever, I would doubt that Christians can be identified with a single kind of occupational guild.
Interesting. That was a good question, though. So that's something to look into on your own, I guess. But yeah, that was a good answer too, for what we know, I guess. And that's fascinating, because you mentioned this whole idea of there being like this poor among them, the equality aspect. And I think you mentioned in the book there being I think it was a temple or some sort of building structure that they repurposed, and there was a word like we're the august ones, and they put over it, we are the poor ones. If I'm not mistaken, I might be getting this wrong. I think somewhere in there you said Maybe
I
I'm.
don't, that doesn't ring a bell
Okay.
for me.
Um.
Well,
Okay.
there's certainly there's the early Christian document called the Shepherd of Hermas has a section in it that it's clearly imagines that the Christ group there, probably in Rome, that's where Hermas is writing from, included both wealthy people or people with at least some means. Um, uh, I think probably freedmen that had some independent wealth, but it also included poorer people. And so Hermas tells this, gives a parable of an elm tree and a vine. And one of the ways in which vines were raised in the ancient world is to let the vine train up a tree. The ancients had not yet invented in viticulture these techniques that we use now, where you get wires stretched a meter or so above the ground and let the vine trail on that. So you lift it off the ground by letting it hang on a tree, and that produces a lot more grapes than if you just let the vine sit on the ground. And so Hermas uses this example, and he says the rich people should think of themselves as the tree, which is unproductive, but it supports the vine, which is productive. That is, and the poor people are the grapes, and the rich people are the oak tree or the elm tree. So this is his way of saying wealthy people in the Christ group should support the poorer people in the Christ group. And in exchange for support, the poor person prays to God for the rich person. So there's a kind of quid pro quo exchange going on here.
Interesting.
The poor person, says out loud, "Thanks be to God for whoever it is," and the rich person has supported the poor person. So Hermas kind of imagines a symbiotic relationship between rich and poor in the group.
Yeah.
That's what I recall saying. There may have been something else,
I actually was able to pull it up. I completely butchered it. That's why you didn't know what I was saying. It was my fault.
okay.
It's a 5th century occupational guild, and there's a mosaic inscription, and they put the term "the lowly guild of fullers." It was
Oh
over
yes, yeah.
over another one that said the most august, most sacred. That's what it was. So I was
Oh,
wrong.
that's
Yeah.
yeah. This was it's an interesting that's an interesting example of how people name themselves. Occupational guilds outside of Christ groups tended to use this rather inflated language, like the worldwide, um, uh, um, the ecumenical, the worldwide association of weavers. Well, there was no worldwide association, but you use this kind of inflated language, or the most august drain cleaners, or something like that. So they like this inflated language. Christian groups, when we start to see them in the 5th century, use this self-deprecating language, the most unworthy. Of course, they don't mean that they're most unworthy. I mean, if they really actually thought they were most unworthy, they wouldn't be putting an inscription to that effect. But it's an interesting way in which language gets re-signified. So, we already see this in gospel material, where say in Luke and in Matthew, um, uh, Jesus is said to thank God that things have not been revealed to the wise, but to the napioi, to the babies. So there you get kind of inversion of status language. So the Christians might think of themselves as, or use the term napioi, the babes. They don't actually seriously think that they're babies. They're using a re-signified word in a special way as an identity term, and it's similarly with these groups of the most unworthy guild of I forget what they were. Um, um, that kind of re-signification of words occurs pretty frequently in religious language.
Yeah, they were a guild of fullers, whatever that means.
Go to Fuller's, yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's an interesting guild because fulling was done with diatomaceous earth and urine,
Oh wow, I did not know that.
and yeah, so Fullers were probably not the kind of people you wanted to hang around a lot with because they would, um,
And
and they were kind of laughed at because a fullery had a bunch of kind of stalls where the workers would put water and these various substances, diatomaceous earth and urine, at the bottom, and then the clothes on top of that, and then kind of hang on to the edge of the stalls and jump up and down. And various people in antiquity, made fun of these hopping people in the fullery shop. Nevertheless, this guild of fullers is apparently a Christian group, and they use they call themselves the most unworthy. They're actually picking up a phrase from Luke 17. That is, in Luke 17, Luke says, when slaves do what they're supposed to be doing, they're simply doing what an unworthy slave does, right? So it's these fullers are picking up that phrase, that identity phrase from Luke 17, applying it to themselves as actually a badge of honor.
yeah, interesting. Before I get to the next super chat, just real quick, I think you mentioned something about Philo having an idea of, you're just a passerby in this world, sort of you're renting for now. This is not your home. You're really, yeah. So do you think they're borrowing from that idea?
That's certainly true. In the early 2nd century, that notion of being, it's called a paroikos, a kind of visitor, gets used to describe Christian identity. Shepherd of Hermas uses it. 1 Peter, first letter of Peter, uses it. So it's the idea that Christians have an ultimate citizenship in the upper world with God, and they have a kind of a temporary relationship with normal political arrangements. And this notion that Philo also has became a useful way for them to think about their relationship, to call themselves paroikoi, visitors or sojourners, or something like that.
Wow, interesting. Dunamis Bacchus has a super chat. Would the soldiers who converted continue soldiering, or would they defect like Cornelius?
We actually don't know what Cornelius did, because it's not said. But yes, some of them continued soldiering. And we've got stories from the 3rd century and the 4th century of especially centurions who were Christian. Now, most of those stories, as the centurion is being promoted, it's discovered by a rival that he's Christian, and then he's called out and usually martyred. But the Roman army was reasonably tolerant of the particular cultic beliefs that its soldiers had. And we see a whole range of cults within the Roman army. Where they would draw the line is if you adhered to a cult that was systemically opposed to the goddess Roma and the genius of the Caesar, of the emperor, and so forth. That's the point at which they draw the line, because that becomes a matter of loyalty and reliability of a soldier. But it's difficult to know just to what extent you had Christians in the army who did what they did. That is, they didn't make any bones about being Christians, but also didn't attract this kind of negative attention. One of my doctoral students, Rebecca Runnison, is just about to publish a very interesting inscription from Kfar Atnai, which is in Israel, mid-3rd century inscription, where a Roman centurion makes a dedication to a Christian church, and he's treated as though he were a brother. Now, there's no indication that he ceased to be a centurion, and there's no indication that he hid the fact that he was affiliated with a Christian group. So evidently, some army members could openly espouse Christianity without fear of retaliation. But as I say, at the points at which they were pushed into a position of having to swear allegiance only to the emperor, and that's the point at which problems occur and martyrdoms occur.
Interesting. That's a interesting point right there. There's another really good question that just came up in the super chat. Thank you for the super chat, Gaius Windex. What does I know, and I was actually going to get to this because you wrote this is mentioned in your book, so this is a great question. What does Pliny the Younger's letters tell us about early Christian groups?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So Pliny, in about 112, he's the governor of Bithynia, which is modern northern Turkey, and he has encountered some Christians in Bithynia, and he writes to Trajan, the emperor, for some advice about what to do. What he knows is, or what he thinks he knows at least, is that Christians will not sacrifice to the emperor and to the gods, and so he uses this as a kind of diagnostic test. He brings a few of them in and asks them to sacrifice, which probably just means burn some incense in a little altar to the genius of the emperor and to the gods. And some would and some wouldn't. Some said yes, they were they had been Christians, but not for a long time. And some apparently refused to worship. And he said without hesitation, and he said, and I warned them one time and a second time to do this, and they didn't. And so without any hesitation, I sent them away. That is, I had them executed. But some Roman citizens I've sent on to you, so you can deal with the problem yourself. So it's a very interesting account. It does indicate that some Christ believers in Bithynia got themselves martyred because they refused to acknowledge the Roman emperor. Others probably did acknowledge, and that was the end of that. There was no problem. Pliny has the tendency of exaggerating numbers. He said, they're in the countryside, they're in the city, they're all genders, they're men and women, they're all types of people, and even all of the ordines, which means all of the legal classes of senator, equestrian, and others. So that's a little bit unbelievable that there's any senators at that point. So he exaggerates things, partly so that he can also make the point that his swift action put an end to this problem, and he's done a great job of being a governor. And Trajan writes back congratulating him about this. It still is an interesting exchange because of the things that Pliny says. He says that he's never been at a trial of a Christian, so he doesn't know whether they're punished for the deeds that they have done, the crimes that they have done, flagitia, or whether the name itself is enough. So he's unsure about this, and that question actually never gets solved by Trajan's rescript. But he says, I did interrogate them, and the sum total, or the sum of their error seems to be this: that they met before dawn to sing a hymn to Christ as God, and then reconvene for a meal of harmless food. They took an oath, to repay debts, and not to engage in adultery, I think he says. So it's interesting, when Pliny actually interrogates them, he says, the only thing I found was a depraved superstition. Now, superstitio in Latin doesn't have the same sense that it has for us. Um, the the opposite of superstitio in Latin is religio. Religio means the correct performance of a religious rite, and superstitio means the excessive or uninformed performance of a religious rite. So he says, I examined these people, and what I found was a depraved superstition. That's not a reason to execute them. That's a reason to say that they're really stupid.
Right.
The fact that they sing a hymn to Christ as God, Pliny surely knows that all sorts of other religious groups sing hymns to Isis as God and to Zeus and so forth. So that's not a problem either. And surely having a meal of harmless food is not a problem, nor is taking an oath to repay debts. I mean, like, how revolutionary is that?
Yeah, that's cool.
So he checks them out, and he basically says, I really can't find. There's nothing terribly subversive about these. They're really stupid people. They're benighted. And yes, when I told them to sacrifice, they didn't. And I told them again, and they still didn't. And that's enough. He says there, interestingly, regardless of what they believe and what they do, I thought that such inflexible obstinacy deserved to be punished. And he uses this term contumacia, which is resistance to a Roman magistrate. It's like he said, cut it out, and they didn't. And so he executed them. That's the kind of attitude that he has. Wow. And when a Roman prefect says, cut it out, you cut it out.
Right.
And they didn't. So it's a really interesting story when you start unpacking what these words that he uses mean.
Now, you mentioned something about this in your book about their showing dependence on Livy's account of the Bacchanalia conspiracy.
Yeah.
Can you tell us?
Yeah, and
that's fascinating.
Okay. Yeah. And so we know that Pliny has read Livy because he quotes Livy in various other places. But the Bacchanalia conspiracy, this is from 186 BC, was one of these conspiracies that kind of sent shockwaves through the Roman elite, because they feared that this Bacchanalia, this Dionysiac group, was going to be a state that replaced the Roman state. And when Livy describes what they did, he says they engaged in carmina, which can mean hymns, but it can also mean a magical incantation. And Pliny uses that term. He says they sang a hymn, a carmen, to Christ as God. In other words, they're not doing magical incantations, they're singing hymns. The Bacchanalians also took an oath, or they were alleged to have taken an oath, a kind of oath against Rome. And the oath is called a sacramentum. Now, Pliny uses that word. He says they've taken a sacramentum to repay debts. In other words, this is not so he's invoking, and then also the Bacchanalia conspiracy supposedly involved cannibalistic meals where they would kidnap Roman kids and eat them alive and stuff like that. And that's why Pliny says they reconvene for a meal of harmless food. So what Pliny is doing there is he's invoking all of the language of the Bacchanalia conspiracy, carmina, sacramentum, and a cibum, a meal, and basically saying, yeah, they've got all those elements, but when you actually look at them, they don't really look like a Bacchanalia conspiracy at all. They're not going to overthrow the state, and they're not talking as if they're going to overthrow the state. So it's a very clever way that Pliny addresses the problem by using categories that he's taken from Livy in order to neutralize them. And that's why his final conclusion is, I've checked these people out, and all I found was a depraved superstition. That is, if he had said, I found, subversion of the Roman state, then he would have reacted in an entirely different way. All of the Christians would have been executed on the spot. He would not have hesitated for 1 second. But his point in describing the Christians using this Livian language is actually to neutralize it and to say it might have sounded like the Bacchanalia conspiracy, but when I checked it out, there was nothing like that.
Interesting. That makes sense. Wow, that's fascinating though. Let me think about the next one I want to, because we only got a few minutes left. Let me just think. Let's do one more real quick. Thank you for your time, by the way. Let's see which one's the best out of these. Oh, yeah. Hang on one second. Okay, that one. Oh, I wanted to ask you about this because there's clearly a communistic lifestyle going through these early Christian groups. Even the Book of Acts sort of lays it out like, what is yours is mine. We live equally. To hand over riches. Don't worry about laying riches up in here, lay them up in heaven. And the Carpocratians have this like similar philosophy, and I think it lines up with the text like Paul. Do you think it's sort of ironic how like American Christian today's like evangelicals are sort of like anti-communist, and they're like they're a lot more like pro-capitalist? You think that's kind of ironic?
I suppose so. I guess what I would say is that the ethos that early Christ groups tried to cultivate and did in fact cultivate was an ethos of mutual support for one another, and that's, I think, actually one of the reasons why people joined. In the ancient world, where there's no social safety nets around at all, there's no socialized medicine, there's no Medicare. If you get sick, you're sick. If you get injured, you're really in trouble. There was just none of the social apparatus that modern Western societies assume, unemployment insurance, all this kind of stuff. There was none of that, right? So you were really pretty much on your own, especially if you moved away from your birth family. If you came from a village in Anatolia or in Palestine or in Egypt, and now you're in Rome, you're by yourself. So one of the attractions, I think, of Christ groups is that they formed this very dense, warm, hot set of social relationships where the obligations of one member to all other members was paramount. And also it provided, to go back to your question about Thessalonians, it provided a pretty articulate ethical set of practices, fidelity in marriage and so forth. In a social situation where none of that really exists outside of of that group, Christians had at least some advantage in recruiting, because you knew that if you became a Christian, you immediately became adopted in a family. In fact, they start calling themselves brother and sister. Yeah. So they start using fictive family language to refer to themselves. It was also noted, this is by sociologist Rodney Stark, and it pertains to the mid 3rd century, when the plague hit, as it did in the mid 2nd century and again in the mid 3rd century. Both Christians and Jews tended to care. Well, let me start the other way around. The elites immediately headed for the hills, right? Get out of Dodge. Christians and Jews tended to care for their own and for their neighbors. So your neighbor wasn't a Christian, but you cared for them anyway. And even though that actually brought with it the danger of the contagion coming to you, in the case of the Antonine plague, which was probably smallpox, keeping people hydrated will reduce mortality. So some of the caregivers would almost certainly die, but some of them wouldn't, and some of those that they cared for would not die. And later on, Julian the Apostate, a Roman emperor, is angry at the fact that Christians and Jews actually cared not only for their own, but for others, whereas pagans headed for the hills when the plague came. So that ethos of mutual care and common care for one another became a sticky practice, right? That gave Christ groups a certain kind of advantage. Now, you might say, looking at the situation of Christian groups in the 21st century, that ethos of common care is not immediately obvious. In fact, with the prosperity gospel, the whole emphasis seems to be believe in Jesus and he'll make you a rich person.
Right. Exactly.
One can think of that as one wants, but it doesn't connect very well with the kind of ethos that Christians developed in the first, second, and third century.
Nice. And do you have time for a couple more questions, or do you have to?
Sure.
Okay. All right. I'll try to get through these. I think I have two more left. One of them is a super chat. Derek from Myth Vision says, "I'm seriously impressed with the caliber of scholarship you've had tonight. Dr. Kloppenborg is amazing." And then he also has a question. It says, "When Paul says to the Galatians, 'I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves.' Does this have anything to do with Addis?" He says.
No, I don't think so. I mean, although I think it's well known that the Galloi, the priest of Addis, castrated themselves, sure. And that was, that sets a kind of pretty high bar for being a priest of Kybele. I think it's a joke about circumcision, about Jewish circumcision, because that's the issue in Galatians, that Paul has a group there of Gentiles, and they have been told by some folks that in order to be a full Christian, you have to become a Jew first, and that means for males you have to be circumcised, and presumably it means that you have to adopt food laws and so forth. And Paul is vehemently opposed to that idea. He doesn't think you have to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. And then he makes this kind of dig. Those people who trouble you, I hope that, the knife slips, as it were. That's, Paul at his rhetorical best.
Wow. Interesting. I just got just two more. How different was Christianity in Rome, the Roman Empire in general, not just Rome, but their empire under Diocletian versus Constantine? Like how different was it then, the change between the two?
Well, under Diocletian, there was pretty much an empire-wide and imperial directed persecution of Christians.
Right.
And then what happens in 308 is Constantine's Edict of Toleration, which doesn't legalize Christianity, but it illegalizes it.
Right.
And it doesn't become a state religion until much later. Yeah. But so that, during the time of Diocletian, you had churches being confiscated, and all of the stuff in churches being confiscated, including their writings and whatever other stuff they had. Christianity was under pretty serious and systemic persecution for a short while under Diocletian, and then that changes radically with the Edict of Toleration with Constantine.
Yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. It seems like a radical, big, quick change of the way of life for a Christian in that time period. It's fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating to think about that. It's just like the world just turning on its head. You know what I mean?
It's not actually clear why Diocletian did this, and that's he did it is clear. Why he did it is still a little bit puzzling. One historian said, they opened up a sacrificial animal and the liver was all messed up, and someone said, well, it's because of the Christians, and and so away we go. Who knows? That's right.
Yeah. And the last question I have is, in the Acts of Peter has a lot about him being Paul and Peter and Simon Magus, all the events that are happening in Rome. How much of this is historical, if any, compared to what's in the story?
I would say probably, I don't work on that very much, but I know a little bit about it, and I would say not very much is historical. Acts of Peter also has Peter being the house guest of a Roman senator, which is extraordinarily unlikely in the mid-first century. But what it does, the Acts of Peter and other kinds of documents actually should be read as documents of their own time, sometime probably in the early 3rd century. And so they reflect the kind of social experience that Christians then would have had. And it would be a mistake to retroject that back to Peter and Simon Magus in the mid first century, but to say that it's in some ways representative of Christian experience in the 3rd century, that's where it is helpful. And I'd say, the same thing about the book of Acts. It's a mistake to read it as a story, as historical data from the mid 1st century. It fits better with the experience of Christians in the early 2nd century, where it's more likely that you get people of high social status in Christ groups, and where the issue of actually the name Christianos first appears in Acts, and that's a term that occurs mostly in the early 2nd century. That's how Pliny knows them. That's how Suetonius knows them. And these are all early 2nd century articles. So the very term itself, Christianos, is really a 2nd century term, and so Acts uses it anachronistically as a 1st century term.
Yeah, that's that's pretty much it. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, that's the last thing I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned how Acts reminds you of a 2nd century story. I've heard from a very trusted scholar, actually I'll just say his name, I'm David Litwa, he's like you, he's going deep into this stuff. He thinks Acts might even be as far as maybe the 140s. Where would you put Acts? And I promise this is the last question.
Yeah, I don't have a special date. I'd say that I read Acts alongside Pliny and alongside First Peter, because they seem to be dealing with the same kinds of issues. That is, how do Christians fit in to the Roman Empire? Are they a countercultural revolutionary group? And for all of them, absolutely not. And that's an issue that becomes an issue as Christ believers become more numerous. When you've only got 25 people in a Christ group, they're practically invisible in political terms. When you've got 1,000 or so in a particular location, then you start to wonder, well, what are these people really about? And are they loyal to the empire? Are they disloyal, and so forth? So those questions come about partly because Christian numbers have started to increase around 110, 120, maybe 140. I don't know. I mean, it's a kind of mug's game, as assigning particular dates, and Litva probably has good reasons for suggesting 140. I'm happy just to say it's sometime in the early 2nd century.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Your book, Christ Associations. It's, guys, I literally recommend getting this book. And is there where do you recommend getting it from? Amazon? Where do you have a website that you think people should go to? What do you think about that?
Well, it's certainly on Amazon. It can be ordered, I think, directly from the publisher, which is Yale University Press. And I suppose all the other electronic media outlets for ordering books will have it. Amazon certainly does, and Yale University Press has it. It's not the kind of thing that's going to show up in your local bookstore, I don't think, unless it's a scholarly bookstore.
It's a lot. It's a big book too. A lot of pages, a lot of information, a lot of diagrams. It's worth it. So check that out. And I think you're going to be on Myth Vision pretty soon, if I'm not mistaken. So
that's right. Yeah.
Be on the lookout for that, guys. And thank you for your time once again. And any last thoughts?
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
And like I always say, you have just attained true know.